There he is, officer. That's the man. He's trespassing on community property and illegally using our lake. Arrest him!" The voice was sharp, a weaponized shrillness that cut through the placid afternoon air. I stood on my own dock, hands still dripping with lake water from checking a new anchor line, and watched a woman I'd later come to know as President Lydia pointing at me. Her finger, tipped with a blood-red nail, was unwavering. The two sheriff's deputies looked from her to me on the dock and back again, their expressions a perfect, unreadable mask of professional neutrality. Little did she know, this wasn't just my property she was screeching about. The entire lake was essentially federal property, and for a very specific reason, it fell under my old jurisdiction. This whole ridiculous drama was about to implode on her in spectacular fashion. If you want to hear the crazy story of how I used my very particular set of skills to dismantle an entire corrupt HOA, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. You're not going to want to miss this. My name is Ben Carter, and for 25 years, I was a commander in the United States Navy, specializing as a hydrographic surveyor. It's a niche field, but a critical one. I've spent a quarter century mapping the unseen world beneath the water's surface, treacherous seabeds off hostile coasts, shifting channels in strategic rivers, and the precise contours of our own nation's inland waterways. It's a job that demands meticulous attention to detail, an intimate understanding of maritime law, and above all, patience. When I retired, all I wanted was the opposite of a cramped survey vessel: space, quiet, and a piece of solid land next to a calm body of water. I found it in a property that was an anomaly, a geographic outlier. It was a 5-acre plot with an old but solid house, fronting a gorgeous body of water called Serenity Lake. The key selling point was its history. It was one of the original homesteads in the county, predating every other development on the water by nearly a century. Its riparian rights, the legal rights of a landowner to the water on their property, were ironclad, grandfathered in, and documented with a chain of title that went back to a land grant signed by the governor in 1890. I did my homework. I spent a week at the county records office before I even made an offer, tracing every map and every deed. My property was an island, legally speaking, surrounded by the much newer master-planned community of Elysian Springs. Elysian Springs was everything my property wasn't. It was manicured, uniform, and governed by a thick book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. But it was on the other side of the inlet, and according to the maps, my land was a separate, sovereign entity. The lake itself was the interesting part, because it connected via a small navigable channel to the Lonsdale River, which in turn fed the interstate waterway system. Serenity Lake wasn't legally a private lake. It was, by federal definition, a navigable water of the United States, placing it under the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers. This was a fact I knew would be my ace in the hole, though I never imagined I'd have to play that card. My first few weeks were bliss. I rebuilt the old, weathered dock, careful to use materials and a design that exceeded all county and state environmental regulations. I bought a simple 16-foot aluminum fishing boat with a quiet tiller motor, nothing fancy, just a tool for enjoying the water. The peace was shattered by the crunch of expensive tires on my gravel driveway. A pristine, glacier-white Range Rover came to a halt, and out stepped a woman who looked like she was genetically engineered in a lab to be an HOA president. She was tall, rail-thin, with a helmet of blonde hair that looked entirely immobile. Her tennis whites were crisper than a new dollar bill. "Hello," she called out, a smile plastered on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Lydia Montague, president of the Elysian Springs Homeowners Association. Just wanted to pop over and officially welcome you to the neighborhood." She extended a hand, and with it, a thick, glossy folder emblazoned with the Elysian Springs logo, a stylized swan on a field of unrelenting beige. I shook her hand briefly. "Ben Carter, nice to meet you. Though, I think there's a small mistake. My property isn't actually part of your HOA." The smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the porcelain facade. "Oh, that's just a little paperwork formality," she said with a dismissive wave. "All properties with frontage on Serenity Lake are mandatory members. It says so right in our bylaws. It's for the good of the community, you know. To maintain the aesthetic and our property values." She tapped the glossy folder. "Everything you need to know is in here. The dues schedule, our architectural review guidelines, and the lake usage rules." I took the packet out of politeness, but my patience for condescending nonsense has been worn thin by decades of dealing with naval bureaucracy. "Lydia, I appreciate the welcome. I really do. But I've reviewed my deed, the title history, and the official county plat maps. My parcel is explicitly excluded from the Elysian Springs Development Tract. I'm not a member." I said it calmly, factually, without an ounce of aggression. To a surveyor, boundaries are sacred. Her eyes narrowed. The feigned friendliness evaporated, replaced by a steely glint of challenge. "Well," she said, her voice now having the pleasant warmth of a freezer door, "the board will have to review your file. But the rules are the rules. We are responsible for the lake, and anyone who uses it must be a member in good standing. We simply can't have unvetted individuals building whatever they want and using our private community asset." She emphasized the word "our" as if she had personally dug the lake with a silver spoon. "It's a navigable waterway, actually," I stated, unable to help myself. "Under federal jurisdiction." Her face went blank. The term federal jurisdiction, clearly not part of her curated vocabulary of fines and violations. "We'll be in touch," she said curtly, turned on her heel, and climbed back into her climate-controlled bubble. As the Range Rover disappeared down my driveway, spitting gravel in its wake, I looked at the glossy folder in my hand. I didn't need to be a hydrographer to chart the storm that was brewing on the horizon. I opened the folder and saw the first page, a fee schedule for monthly dues that was more than my first mortgage payment. I set it down on my workbench and labeled a new empty manila folder with a black marker, "Suburban Warfare." It was time to start gathering intelligence. The opening salvo in Lydia's campaign of bureaucratic attrition came a week later. It was a crisp, official-looking letter on Elysian Springs letterhead, informing me that my account was past due for the initial new member capital contribution of $2,000, plus the first month's dues of $500. A late fee of $50 had already been applied. I read it, let out a dry chuckle, and slid it neatly into the Suburban Warfare folder. I responded with a polite, brief letter of my own, via certified mail with return receipt requested. In it, I reiterated that my property was not subject to her HOA's covenants, and included a photocopy of the county plat map, highlighting my parcel's distinct boundary lines. I considered it a closed matter. Lydia, it turned out, considered it a declaration of war. The violation notices began arriving with the frequency of junk mail. The first was for unapproved dock construction. It cited a non-existent clause in her HOA bylaws requiring all docks to be submitted for approval to the Architectural Review Committee, of which she was, naturally, the chair. The notice included a photo of my newly finished dock, taken from a boat on the water, likely by Lydia herself on some kind of snooping mission. A fine of $100 per day was attached, retroactive to the day she first saw it. That went into the folder. Next came a violation for non-compliant watercraft. Apparently, my humble aluminum fishing boat, with its perfectly functional but decidedly unglamorous 15-horsepower motor, violated the community aesthetic standards, which required all boats to be of a certain yacht-like quality and preferably white or navy blue. My boat was, of course, bare aluminum. Another $200 fine. Into the folder it went. Then came failure to adhere to community landscaping standards. My crime was allowing the natural shoreline vegetation reeds, native grasses, and wildflowers that prevented erosion and provided habitat for wildlife to exist. Elysian Springs apparently demanded every inch of shoreline be a chemically treated, perfectly manicured turf lawn, running right down to the water's edge in a disastrous display of ecological ignorance. This fine was $500. The folder was getting satisfyingly thick. It became clear that I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous volunteer. I was dealing with a petty tyrant who saw my refusal to bend the knee as a personal insult to her authority. The irony, of course, was that her authority was a complete fabrication, a castle built on a foundation of sand. But a tyrant with a dedicated following is still a danger. I needed to understand the lay of the land, so to speak. I started taking walks through the Elysian Springs neighborhood, just to observe. It was Stepford perfect. Every lawn was identical. Every mailbox was the same shade of beige. Every house had the same approved palette of muted earth tones. It felt less like a community and more like a high-end, open-air prison. On one of these walks, an older gentleman tending his perfectly manicured rose bushes gave me a hesitant nod. He had a kind face, etched with the weary resignation of someone who had fought and lost a few battles. I introduced myself, and he introduced himself as Bob, a retired accountant. "You're the fellow in the old Miller place, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. "The one giving Lydia fits?" I admitted I was. Bob leaned on his trowel and looked around conspiratorially, as if the azaleas had ears. "Good for you," he whispered. "Someone needs to stand up to her. She runs this place like it's her personal fiefdom. The board is just her cronies. They vote for whatever she wants, no questions asked." This was the opening I needed. I asked him about the lake. "Oh, that's her pride and joy," Bob sighed. "She convinced everyone years ago that the HOA owned it outright. Got some lawyer friend of her husband's to write a confusing opinion letter, and she's been waving it around ever since. Charges us a fortune in lake management fees. Said she had to dredge the channel last year. Charged every household a $2,000 special assessment for it. Funny thing is," he looked over his shoulder again, "I'm retired. I'm home all day. I watched that lake. Never saw a single piece of dredging equipment. My internal alarms, the ones honed by years of sniffing out fudged data and incomplete reports, went off loud and clear. This wasn't just about a power trip anymore. This was about money. Large sums of it. I thanked Bob for his candor and told him if he ever wanted to chat more, he knew where I lived. He gave me a knowing look and said, "I might just take you up on that." Bob's revelation lit a fire under me. My methodical nature, the very core of my professional being, took over. This was no longer a defensive operation. It was time to go on the offensive, and my weapons were public records. I escalated my research from a simple property line confirmation to a full-blown forensic investigation. I drove to the state capitol and pulled the original articles of incorporation for the Elysian Springs Homeowners Association, Inc. I read every line, every amendment. As I suspected, the charter explicitly defined the HOA's geographic boundaries, and the legal description matched the plat map perfectly. My property was outside of it. Furthermore, the charter granted the HOA authority over common areas within the development. It made absolutely no mention of any authority, ownership, or control over the water, bed, or shoreline of Serenity Lake. Lydia's entire claim was built on thin air. This was the first smoking gun. Then, I went deeper into the world I knew best. Waterway law. I contacted a former colleague of mine, a civilian director at the Army Corps of Engineers Regional Headquarters. I explained the situation, and he laughed. "Ben, it sounds like you've run into a classic case of what we call condominium delusion. These HOAs think because they're next to the water, they own the water." He emailed me the official file on Serenity Lake. It was all there in black and white. Its official designation as a navigable water of the United States, the history of its use for commerce in the early 20th century, and the public access rights that came with that designation. Restricting access or falsely claiming private ownership of such a waterway was a violation of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. A federal offense. This was smoking gun number 2, and it was a cannon. I printed every document, every statute, every map, and every relevant legal precedent. My suburban warfare folder became a heavy 3-inch thick binder, with tab sections for property, title, HOA corporate records, federal waterway statutes, and correspondence with tyrant. While I was building my case, Lydia was escalating her tactics. She had two men in polo shirts, bearing a cheap-looking Elysian Springs security logo, park a golf cart at the end of my driveway for hours at a time, just staring. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation. My response was to install 4 high-resolution night vision security cameras covering every angle of my property. I made sure one was clearly visible, aimed right at their little rent-a-cop station. They stopped parking there the next day. The grim satisfaction was immense. This woman had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet retiree. She had no idea she was prodding a man who had spent his career defining lines that nations went to war over. Her little beige kingdom was about to run up against the full, unyielding force of federal law and property rights, and I was going to enjoy every second of the collision. The tipping point came from Bob, the retired accountant. A week after our clandestine chat amongst the rose bushes, he showed up at my front door looking nervous but resolute. He held a thin file folder. "Ben," he said, stepping inside, "I think I was wrong. It's not just that the dredging never happened. I think the money is gone." My quiet invitation to chat had been taken up, and he had brought with him the first thread that would unravel Lydia's entire tapestry of deceit. Bob, it turned out, was not just any accountant. He was a retired forensic accountant who had spent 30 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He knew precisely where to look for the bodies, financially speaking. He explained that after our talk, he teamed up with another quiet dissenter in the community, a woman named Susan, who was a paralegal. Using Susan's knowledge of the state's sunshine laws for homeowners associations, they had formally requested to inspect the HOA's financial records. Lydia had stalled, delayed, and thrown up every possible roadblock, claiming the records were with their auditors, or being organized. But a sharply worded letter from the law firm where Susan worked, citing the specific statutes and the penalties for non-compliance, finally forced Lydia's hand. She grudgingly gave them access to a QuickBooks file and a box of receipts. "It's a complete mess, Ben," Bob said, spreading printouts across my large oak dining table, which was fast becoming our war room. "But it's a deliberate mess. She's hiding things in plain sight." For the next hour, Bob walked me through a labyrinth of shell games and creative bookkeeping that was as beautiful in its audacity as it was criminal. The $2,000 special assessment for lake dredging from each of the 150 households, a sum totaling $300,000, had been paid in full to a company called Lakeside Restoration Services, LLC. Bob had done a corporate search. Lakeside Restoration Services was a brand new entity, registered just a month before the assessment was announced. The registered agent and sole officer was a man named Dennis Montague, Lydia's brother. The company's address was a P.O. box. It had no equipment, no employees, and no prior business history. The entire $300,000 had been transferred out of the company's account and into various other accounts within weeks. It didn't stop there. The HOA's landscaping contract, worth over $100,000 a year, was with Evergreen Prestige Landscaping. The owner was the cousin of the HOA board's vice president. Bob had gotten quotes from 3 other reputable local firms. The going rate for the services provided was less than half of what Evergreen Prestige was charging. Money from the Community Social Fund had been used to pay exorbitant invoices to a catering company owned by the board secretary's wife. It was a classic, self-contained ecosystem of grift. Lydia and her cronies weren't just maintaining their property values, they were strip-mining their neighbors' bank accounts. This changed everything. It was no longer a personal battle over my property rights. It was about liberating an entire community from a corrupt regime. We now had Bob the accountant, Susan the paralegal, and me, the surveyor with a binder full of federal law. We were a team. We met again a few days later, this time with Susan present. She was sharp, no-nonsense, and radiated competence. She'd already identified the specific state laws Lydia and the board had broken regarding fiduciary duty and self-dealing. The case against them was overwhelming. Our strategy session was methodical and precise. We laid out a 3-pronged attack. Front 1, Susan said, tapping a legal pad, is the civil and criminal front. Bob's work is the ammunition. I will draft a formal demand letter to the board, laying out our findings and demanding their immediate resignation and restitution of the funds. I will simultaneously prepare a complaint package, complete with all of Bob's forensic analysis, to be filed with the State Attorney General's office. This isn't just a lawsuit. It's evidence for a criminal prosecution. Front 2, I said, patting my heavy binder, is the regulatory front. This is my department. I'll finalize my complaint to the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not just sending it to the regional office. I'm sending it directly to their Office of Counsel in D.C. and copying the U.S. Coast Guard and the state's Department of Environmental Protection. My report will detail the HOA's illegal attempts to restrict a federal waterway, their fraudulent claims of ownership, and the potential navigational hazards their ignorant rules could create. Coming from a retired Navy hydrographer, it will get their immediate attention. And Front 3, Bob added, is the community front, the court of public opinion. While they're reeling from the legal and federal attacks, we go to the homeowners. We can't just dump this on them. We need to build a coalition. I'll talk to a few more people I trust. We'll show them the evidence, piece by piece. We'll show them how much of their money has been stolen. Once we have enough support, we force a special meeting to recall the entire board. The plan was solid, but it was missing one key element, a catalyst. We couldn't just launch our attack from the shadows. We needed Lydia to make one final, public, undeniable mistake. We needed to bait her into an overreaction she couldn't walk back, and I knew exactly how to do it. She's obsessed with controlling the lake, I said. Her power is derived from that illusion. I'm going to do something on that lake that is so perfectly legal, so technically correct, and so utterly infuriating to her that she won't be able to stop herself from making a scene. Susan and Bob looked at me. What are you going to do? Susan asked. I smiled. I'm going to improve navigational safety on Serenity Lake. I'm going to install a new, federally compliant private aid to navigation buoy marking the submerged rock shoal near my property line. It's something I'm uniquely qualified to do. And to make it all perfectly above board, I'll file the proper notification paperwork with the Coast Guard Auxiliary and the County Sheriff's Marine Patrol Division beforehand. It was the perfect trap. An act of public service that, to Lydia's twisted mind, would look like the ultimate invasion of her sovereign territory. We would let her build her own gallows. All I had to do was provide the rope, and she would gleefully wrap it around her own neck. The day of the operation, what I privately termed Operation Buoy, oh boy, was a perfect Tuesday in late summer. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the lake was like glass. It was the kind of day that made you forget about petty tyrants and fraudulent accounting. But I had a job to do. I'd received confirmation emails from both the Coast Guard Auxiliary Flotilla Commander and the Sheriff's Department's Marine Patrol Sergeant, acknowledging my notice to private aid to navigation placement. Everything was by the book. My trap was set, documented, and officially sanctioned. I loaded the bright orange regulation spec buoy into my little aluminum boat. It wasn't large, but it was conspicuous, with the proper reflective markings and a symbol for isolated danger, indicating the submerged rocks below. From my dock, I could see Lydia's large pontoon boat, the Elysian Queen, bobbing gently at her dock across the inlet. The stage was set. I motored out slowly to the predetermined coordinates I'd plotted, using my professional-grade handheld GPS. I anchored my boat and began the process of setting the buoy's concrete anchor, checking the chain length for the correct scope, and ensuring it sat perfectly upright in the water. It was a simple, satisfying task, the kind of work I'd done 1,000 times before in far more challenging waters. I hadn't been working for more than 15 minutes when the telltale rumble of a high-performance engine echoed across the water. It wasn't Lydia's pontoon boat. It was her husband's ostentatious wakeboarding boat, a monstrosity of glitter-flake gel coat and chrome, with Lydia standing at the bow like a furious figurehead on a war galley. Her husband, a meek-looking man named Richard, who always looked vaguely apologetic for existing, was at the helm. She was screaming before they were even within 100 feet. "What do you think you are doing? You cannot put that thing in our lake." Her voice echoed across the placid water, startling a flock of geese into flight. I ignored her. I calmly continued my work, tightening the last shackle on the buoy chain. This only enraged her further. She directed Richard to circle me, their wake rocking my small, stable boat. It was a classic intimidation tactic, and a dangerously foolish one. I simply braced myself, held on, and continued. "I am the president of this community. I am ordering you to cease and desist. Richard, call the police. Call them right now." I finished my work. The buoy was set, floating proudly, a beacon of both safety and defiance. I gave it a final satisfied pat, pulled up my anchor, and started to motor slowly back to my dock. I could hear her on the phone, her voice a panic shriek. "Yes, 911! There's a man! He's illegally dumping things in our private lake! He's a menace! He's trespassing! You need to get here immediately and arrest him." By the time I had tied my boat to my dock, I could hear the distant wail of sirens growing closer. Perfect. The bait had been taken. She hadn't just nibbled at it. She had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. I walked up to my house and retrieved my suburban warfare binder. I pulled out a specific folio of documents I had prepared for just this occasion, certified copies of my deed and the county plat map, a printout of the Army Corps of Engineers file on the lake's federal status, and copies of my correspondence with the Sheriff's Department about the buoy. I walked back down to my dock and waited. I was perfectly calm. In the Navy, we called this battle space preparation. 2 county sheriff's cruisers pulled down my driveway. Lydia was there to meet them, practically vibrating with indignant rage. She pointed dramatically at me as I stood on my dock. "There he is, officer. That's the man. He's trespassing on community property and illegally using our lake. Arrest him." 2 deputies got out of their cars. One was older, with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and a weathered, seen-it-all look on his face. The other was younger, sharp, and attentive. They approached Lydia first, letting her vent her geyser of accusations. I saw the sergeant's eyes glaze over slightly, a look I recognized as the universal expression of a cop dealing with a Karen. After she finally wound down, the sergeant, whose name tag read Miller, turned his attention to me. He and the younger deputy, Sanchez, walked to the edge of the lawn overlooking my dock. "Sir," Miller called out, his voice polite but firm, "can you come up here and talk to us for a moment?" "Certainly, officer," I replied. I walked up the path from the dock, holding my folio of documents. "This woman has filed a complaint," Miller began, gesturing vaguely toward Lydia, who was watching with her arms crossed, a smug look of anticipated victory on her face. "She's alleging you're trespassing on Elysian Springs community property and placing an unpermitted object in their private lake." I maintained a calm, neighborly demeanor. "Officer, there seems to be a significant misunderstanding, and I believe this woman has filed a false report." Lydia gasped in theatrical outrage. "First," I said, ignoring her and addressing Miller directly, "this property is not, nor has it ever been, part of the Elysian Springs HOA. This folio contains a certified copy of the county plat map, clearly showing my parcel's boundaries, along with a certified copy of my deed." I handed the folder to him. Miller took it and began to thumb through the first few pages. His eyes scanned the plat map, his brow furrowing in concentration. He then looked at the deed. He looked from the documents, up to my house, and then to me. His professional mask slipped for just a second, replaced by a flicker of recognition. His eyes darted down to the simple, faded baseball cap I was wearing. It was an old Navy cap, with a small, discreet insignia of the Navy Civil Engineer Corps, the Seabees, in it. His posture changed instantly. It wasn't dramatic, but it was a tectonic shift. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. "Sir," he said, his tone completely different. It was now laced with a deep, unmistakable respect. "Forgive me for asking, are you Commander Carter?" I was taken aback for a second. It had been years since anyone had called me that. "Retired, yes, but that was my rank. Just Ben is fine." Deputy Miller's back became ramrod straight. He looked at his younger partner Sanchez and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Ma'am," Miller said, turning to face Lydia, his voice now devoid of any warmth. It was pure, official ice. "You seem to be operating under some severe misconceptions." Lydia's smug expression began to curdle. "What are you talking about? He admitted it. He's a commander of something," she sputtered, clearly not understanding the context. "Ma'am," Miller continued, his voice cutting through her sputtering, "Commander Carter is a retired officer from the United States Navy. His specialization was hydrographic surveying. That means he is a professional expert in mapping and managing waterways. Secondly, this document he provided," he held up the printout, "from the Army Corps of Engineers, confirms that Serenity Lake is not your private lake. It is a federally controlled, navigable waterway. If anyone has the authority and the knowledge to be placing a navigational aid buoy in that lake, it's him. In fact," Miller added, looking back at me, "he's likely doing the county and every boater on this lake a service by marking a known hazard." Lydia's face went through a spectacular series of color changes, from furious crimson to the pallid white of cheap plaster. She was opening and closing her mouth like a fish, but no sound was coming out. Then, Sergeant Miller did something that sealed her humiliation. He faced me squarely, brought his hand up in a sharp, perfect salute, and held it. "Thank you for your service, Commander." The younger deputy, Sanchez, a Marine Corps veteran as I later learned, immediately followed his partner's lead, his own salute just as crisp. I was stunned. I hadn't expected this. I returned the salutes with a nod of my head, a gesture of mutual respect between veterans. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Deputy." The sound of the salutes seemed to echo in the sudden, ringing silence. Lydia stood there, frozen, her world visibly crumbling around her. Miller dropped his salute and turned back to her, his expression now one of severe displeasure. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a misdemeanor offense. However, making fraudulent claims of ownership over a federal waterway and attempting to restrict public access, that could attract the attention of agencies that have a lot more power than the county sheriff's office. I strongly advise you to go home and to leave this man and his property alone." Without another word, he and Sanchez turned, walked back to their cruisers, and drove away, leaving Lydia Montague standing alone on my property line, utterly and completely defeated in the bright afternoon sun. The suburban warfare binder had just won its first major battle, and the shockwave was about to bring the whole rotten structure down. The public spectacle of two sheriff's deputies saluting me while dressing down their HOA president was the cannon shot that signaled the start of a revolution in Elysian Springs. The story, embellished with every telling, ripped through the neighborhood's email chains and cul-de-sac gossip circles. Lydia Montague, the unassailable queen, had been publicly exposed as a fraud. Her power, built on a foundation of intimidation and lies, evaporated overnight. My bait and switch with the buoy had worked more perfectly than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a win, it was a public shaming, a loss of face from which she could never recover. Mark, the young homeowner fined for his basketball hoop, and Bob, the forensic accountant, immediately seized the momentum. They drafted a petition calling for an emergency community-wide meeting to discuss the legal and financial status of the HOA. Armed with the story of the police confrontation and whispers of federal jurisdiction, they had no trouble getting the required number of signatures. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday in the community clubhouse, a building that had previously served as Lydia's throne room. Now, it was to be the site of her trial. Our team, Susan, Bob, and I, prepared meticulously. Susan finalized her presentation on the board's financial malfeasance, creating easy-to-understand charts that showed exactly where the money went. Bob prepared to give a step-by-step account of his investigation into the fake dredging company and the inflated contracts. My role was to explain the truth about the lake. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. I saw faces I'd never seen before. People who had clearly been suffering under Lydia's reign in silence, now drawn out by the scent of blood in the water. Lydia and her two remaining board cronies sat at a table at the front, looking pale and beleaguered. She attempted to open the meeting with her usual air of authority, but her voice was thin and lacked conviction. Bob spoke first. With the quiet, unimpeachable authority of an old IRS investigator, he laid out the case. He didn't use inflammatory language, he just stated the facts, presenting canceled checks, corporate registration documents, and comparative market bids. When he got to the 300, zero paid to Lakeside Restoration Services, LLC, owned by Lydia's brother, for a dredging project that never occurred. A collective gasp went through the room. People were looking at their checkbook stubs, at their neighbors. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Susan followed. She explained in clear, concise terms the legal concept of fiduciary duty. She outlined how the board had breached that duty through self-dealing and gross negligence. Then she delivered the bombshell. She was holding a copy of a formal criminal complaint that she had filed that very afternoon with the state attorney general's office. This was no longer just an internal HOA squabble. It was an active criminal investigation. Then it was my turn. I didn't introduce myself as commander. I was just Ben Carter, their neighbor from the old Miller place. I projected the official Army Corps of Engineers map onto the screen behind me. For years, I began, you've all been told that you own this lake. You've been paying fees to manage it, police it, and dredge it. The truth is, you don't own it. The American public owns it. I explained its status as a navigable waterway. I explained the federal laws that Lydia had been breaking by trying to restrict access and claiming ownership. I explained that her actions, far from protecting their property values, had exposed the entire HOA and, by extension, every member, to potentially massive fines and legal action from the federal government. I can confirm, I added, that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is now aware of the situation. You should expect to hear from them. The combination of the three presentations was devastating. The residents were hit with a trifecta of betrayals. Their money had been stolen, their trust had been violated, and they had been placed in legal jeopardy by the very people elected to protect them. The floor was open for questions, and it was a bloodbath. Lydia tried to defend herself, resorting to her old tactics of blustering and talking down to people, but it didn't work. The deference was gone. People who had been afraid to speak up for years were now standing and demanding answers. Her explanations were flimsy and fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. When someone asked about the police saluting me, she simply muttered, "It was a misunderstanding," and refused to elaborate. Within an hour, a motion was made from the floor to recall the entire board of directors. It passed with a near-unanimous roar of "aye." Lydia and her two allies sat there, stunned into silence, officially stripped of all power. The fallout was swift and satisfying. 2 weeks later, the HOA received a blistering letter from the legal counsel of the Army Corps of Engineers. It ordered them to immediately remove all signage, claiming the lake was private, and to issue a formal written retraction to all homeowners clarifying the lake's public status. The letter also included a notice of a fine for $25,000 for attempting to impede a public waterway, with a warning that further violations would be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. The state attorney general's investigation moved forward with surprising speed. Presented with Bob's meticulously organized evidence, they had a ready-made case. 6 months later, Lydia, her husband Richard, for his complicity, her brother Dennis, and the 2 other recalled board members were indicted on multiple counts of felony, fraud, and embezzlement. The news reports showed Lydia not in her crisp tennis whites, but in a drab pantsuit, scurrying past reporters outside the county courthouse. Her pristine Range Rover was soon sold to help cover the astronomical legal fees. The last I heard, she and Richard were forced to sell their house to pay the court-ordered restitution to the homeowners. A new HOA board was elected, with Bob as the treasurer and Susan serving as a pro bono legal advisor. They immediately slashed the dues, abolished the litany of ridiculous aesthetic rules, and started a transparent process for managing the community's actual needs. the neighborhood seemed to exhale. Color returned literally. The basketball hoops came back in various shades. People planted wildflowers instead of turf grass. The oppressive beige uniformity was broken. My relationship with my neighbors in Elysian Springs transformed. I was no longer the defiant outsider. I was the guy who had liberated them. I got waves and smiles on my walks, invitations to barbecues, and quiet words of thanks from people like Mark, whose kids could finally play basketball without fear of a fine. I sit on my dock now, most evenings, watching the sun set over the calm, peaceful water. My simple fishing boat is tied up, bobbing gently. Not far from the shore, the orange buoy stands its silent watch over the submerged rocks, a humble monument to a strange and unexpected war. My suburban warfare binder sits on a shelf in my office, a relic of a conflict won not with force, but with facts. It's a reminder that a bully's power often rests on a fragile scaffolding of lies, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to check the official record to send the whole thing crashing down. The water is clear, the air is clean, and the lake is quiet, open, and free just as it was always meant to be. And for the first time since I moved here, it feels like home.